Hello there, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us today. We call this The Influence every Tuesday at 8:30 here on the Revival Center YouTube page, where we discuss different topics. We do different teachings, different studies. Over the course of many years now, we have been doing this, and so thank you so much for joining us. My name is Pastor Jason Allums. This is Pastor Jason White. If you want to greet everyone real quick.
Yeah, good morning. We hope y'all are doing well. You mentioned been doing it for a while. I don't know if you know this, but we're coming up on the 100th episode here in about a month and a half.
Yeah, how about that? So yeah, time flies when you're having fun. Behind the screen here on the computer, we have Aaron Limbaugh. So if you would like to jump on there, if you're watching this live, then you can jump on there right now and do a comment. And we would love to connect with you in some way here on social media. So let's get into it. Make sure you like the video. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. That's how we increase the influence. And everyone who likes the video or subscribes, we call you a partner of influence, and because that helps us get this word out. But as we get into the teaching today, over the last several Tuesdays, we've been asking the question, are you going to vote in 2024? This is the political season that we're in, so this is funny season, this is crazy season, chaotic, all the different stuff that's taking place. And so we wanted to speak to those issues in the context of Scripture, also in a historical context of the church and America, and ask the question, what would the church today be preaching or teaching if this was 1720? Leading up to the American Revolutionary War. So we invite you to go back and listen to part 1 and part 2. This is going to be part 3. I read a very sad statistic over the last week or so that said, don't quote me on this, you can Google this real quick if you want to, if you're sitting by your computer to check it out, but I think I saw the number of 100 million Christians who go to church are not planning on voting.
Yeah, I've heard that too. Not necessarily that high, but like 40 million. It's like, man, what are we doing?
Right. That could be a major, depending upon where those 40 to 100 million Christians are that's not going to vote, depending upon the state in which they're in, that could be a major difference in this year's election because, last year, some states were only won by 10,000 votes. And so that could be a major deal. And I don't understand that why Christians would not participate and would not vote in America, which again is why we're doing this, to show the difference between the church of 1720 and the church of 2024. So with all that being said, we're going to get into it. And by review of last week, the way we ended it, we talked about a book, and I'm going to mention it again here in a little bit, but the book is called Shepherds for Sale. Again, go back and watch part 2, you'll see it. But in that book, the author does a tremendous job of showing how large churches, organizations over the years have been co-opted by a political agenda, not on the right, but on the left, where they have used their money and their influence and have infected universities that produce preachers. They have infected nonprofit organizations over the years and has deluded them not to preach the gospel but to preach their agenda, to the point to where every old line mainstream denomination in America has split at least once due to the political influence of the liberal left. Case in point, very recently, the United Methodist Church. It was an old line denomination that split over gay marriage and gay rights. Well, where did that influence come from? Well, Shepherds for Sale, that book, chronicles how it happened. It gives research on how that influence took place. And so that's how we ended part 2. Part 3 is, what would the church today, what would the church in 2024 say if we were living in the 1720s and the American Revolutionary War was just around the corner? So that's what we're fixing to get into today. This is the new material. So what would the church say? in 1720, this church, 2024, say in 1720? Would they say, hey, stay out of politics. Stay out of the controversies of the day. Do not lend a voice to the hot button issues that we're surrounded with in our time in 1720. Well, let's compare. At the beginning of the 1720s, just prior to the Great Awakening's commencement, listen to what I just said, 1720s, right before the Great Awakening happened in the colony states, the 13 English colonies were very religiously divided. And the majority of the New Englanders belonged to the congregational churches. Mm-hmm. The middle colonies were your Quakers, Anglicans, Lutherans, Baptists, Presbyterians, the Dutch Reformed, and congregational followers were the makeup. The southern colonies were mostly members of the Anglican Church, but there were also Baptists, Presbyterians, and Quakers. So what happened is the Great Awakening sowed the seeds that produced the American Revolutionary War. It's an understudied and under-talked about dynamic of what the Great Awakening did, because many people only refer to the Great Awakening as a mass revival of people getting saved and giving their hearts to the Lord, which is true. Yeah. But there's another dynamic that the Great Awakening did in the context of the founding of this country.
Yeah. So we had a lot of different more leaders, like that, speakers, sermon pastors that came out of this. So I'm going to start by talking about one of them. One of the most famous is Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards was born in 1703 and died in 1758. He was the first leader in the movement to earn the national spotlight. He was a Yale graduate. So that gives me hope that because Yale's very liberal today. Back then it wasn't as liberal. So maybe there's hope that it'll become...
Well, and it also shows you how that book, Shepherds for Sale, is so true. That Yale started off as an institute to produce ministers and pastors. And Jonathan Edwards was a graduate of Yale, not because he wanted to go to an Ivy League, but because that is the college you would go to be a preacher.
As a product of that.
Yeah. Yeah. But yet now Yale is so liberal and left-wing that they are, siding with Hamas and being anti-Semitic and wanting to get rid of the Jews. And so it shows you how when people begin to take the money and take the influence from a liberal agenda, how it corrupts everything.
Mm-hmm. Completely changed it. But he was a Yale graduate and he ministered in Northampton, Massachusetts. And his message was this: it was powerful, and at times it was terrifying for many to hear. All men and women, this was the theme of a lot of his messages. All men and women were born as sinners. If he or she did not accept Jesus Christ and seek salvation, then eternal fire and brimstone awaited them in hell. His most famous sermon was "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." Yeah. It's been referred to many, many times. And just listen to that title, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." That pretty much is a synopsis of what he preached. But it wasn't just repentance. There were other things that led, like we've talked about, to the Revolutionary War. The church standing up, doing the right thing. Mm-hmm. In Europe at this time, you had the Age of Reasoning happening. That's why a lot of colonists left Europe and came to the colonies, is because Europe was becoming very, we could call it today, leftist. The age of reason, philosophy, science. They were leaving God, and a lot of the colonists that came to all the different colonies were seeking some type of religious freedom. Have their own churches, be able to pray they wanted to pray. But anyway, that's another, we can jump on that later. But so that was Jonathan Edwards. We had another leader of the Great Awakening named George Whitefield. He's probably the most famous along with Jonathan Edwards. He was born in 1714. Died in 1770. He was an ordained Church of England minister from Britain. So he was from Britain. He came to Georgia, the colony of Georgia, in 1739, and he embarked on multiple tours up and down the seaboard, speaking to churches, outdoors, tent revivals, and he was connecting independent denominations through one unifying message. That message was Jesus Christ. His sermons were so powerful that tens of thousands of listeners would turn out to see him. In 1 year, check this out, think about travel. In 1 year, Whitefield covered 5,000 miles and spoke over 350 times.
And that was before the age of electricity.
Yeah, there's no airplane.
Yeah, or cars or nothing else.
And, you know, there's 365 days a year, right? So if he spoke 350 times, he almost spoke or gave a message every single day for a year.
That's
How about that? His delivery style during his sermons was more theatrical than anyone had ever witnessed. We would probably call him very charismatic today. His passion and his raw energy excited his audiences and invoked an energy within them that reinvigorated their faith. He became one of, if not, the most famous men in the colonies. He sparked the Great Awakening, along with Edwards and some others. Benjamin Franklin, who was a religious skeptic. If you know anything about Ben Franklin, he had a lot of different philosophies on life. But he even became so enthralled, engaged with Whitefield that he became a friend of Whitefield. So the work of Edwards, Whitefield, and others who followed in their footsteps did much to usher in an era of defiance against the social and religious hierarchy in the colonies. An individual's personal relationship with God took the forefront. This in turn led to the loosening of dependence between Great Britain and her subjects on religious matters. So this began the strain that led to the war.
It was a spark, and there's no denying the role of preachers in the church in the Great Awakening that produced what we understand America today. Because of the Great Awakening was a national occurrence. You just heard how many miles and how many sermons was preached up and down the seaboard from Georgia to Maine. Because it was a national occurrence, the colonies were able to find common ground and a place aside their differences between them for the collective good, because each of those religious sects had different theological viewpoints, but they came together around some unifying aspect of faith, even though they may approach eschatology different things like that, but they still came around this idea of giving their heart to the Lord Jesus. For many young minds who would take the lead in the struggle for independence during the American Revolution a little bit later, it was the Great Awakening, which was the first time that they were encouraged to defy the norms instituted on them by the crown and those in power. Religion and self-determination could coexist, and that's where it began to come together, this idea of independence. That belief was amplified as the eve of the American Revolution dawned. It was the children of the Great Awakening that then fought for the self-determination of the country. Let me say that again. It was the children of the Great Awakening parents. The parents got saved. The parents went to these altars, and their children are the ones who produced the American Revolutionary War in America as we know it. Please let that sink in for a second. The term Black Robe Regiment is where this term Black Robe Regiment came from the American Revolutionary War. Maybe you've never heard of that, but let me explain what that is. Again, what would the 2024 church today say in 1770? How would they respond to the American Revolutionary War? Would they take up arms and say, let's fight, against Britain, or would they cower down? Well, the Black Robe Regiment is a very historically interesting story. It refers not to a literal regiment of soldiers that wore black robes into battle, but rather to the influential clergymen who promoted American independence and supported the military struggle against Great Britain. Please let that sink in. Imagine Pastor Jason right here preaching on Sunday, and then as soon as the sermon is over, I grab my rifle and I say, okay, let's head to the battlefield and fight the British. That's exactly what that means, ladies and gentlemen. By encouraging the patriot cause, those ministers helped muster critical support among the members of their congregations. Advocates of the British crown, so the other side, found preachers' support of the patriot cause particularly detrimental to their efforts to maintain loyalty among the colonists. So again, this is where you have to begin to recognize the role of the preachers. Great Britain recognized that because the preachers were on the side of independence, it was going to hurt their cause. It would have helped their cause if they could have maintained the preachers' support and loyalty because of the influence that preachers have on a society. And it's true today as well. So such clergymen provided sanction for the cause of independence as well as formal support for the military effort. Again, compare that today. Why would the liberal agenda want to influence the churches in America? Why? Because the churches are supposed to be preaching a gospel-centric message about Jesus Christ and following Him and having a biblical worldview, that there's only two genders, a male and a female, that traditional marriage is between that biological male and a biological female, and to preach the institution of the family as designed by God, and again, that biblical worldview. Well, for the liberal who is more atheist in nature, the Marxist who is more atheist in nature, the socialist who is more atheist in nature, needs to pull the society away from that biblical worldview. Mm-hmm. But the issue that they have is the preacher in the pulpit preaching the gospel. So that's, again, where that book comes into play. Shepherds for Sale. They begin to strategize, how can we silence the preacher? Well, we can't just go shoot them. We can't just go lock them up. Well, let's change their message. Yeah. Let's get them not to preach a biblical worldview. Let's get them to preach our worldview. And so that is what has taken place over the last, 75 years, I would say, is that you've had this liberalization of the pulpit that has destroyed denominations, split families, split churches, split everybody, and it has weakened this coalition around a biblical morality that has now led to this craziness that we see in 2024.
You hear all the time that the country's never been divided like it is now. And there's some truth to that. But you said something before we keep going. This was a time in our history where they were all colonies. They weren't a country yet. They were coming to that. But then you also had people within those colonies who were known as loyalists.
That's right.
That were still loyal to the crown.
They were.
So there was still, there was division.
There was.
There was a lot of division, just like there is now. Maybe the issues were different. Not as liberal now, but they were still
enough to make someone shoot and kill someone.
That's right. Still very divided.
Very much.
Right? And it goes back to what you said a second ago with the biblical worldview. The biblical worldview gives us a lot of concrete things, but one concrete thing. There is right and there is wrong. Right. Mm-hmm. And you said it, the atheists, the Marxists, they try to blur what right and wrong is. The Bible tells us what is right and wrong. And so that kind of was a spark that led to the revolution, along with other things that we see right now. It's no different with the issues, and we have a side that's very, biblical, and then we have the side that's very leftist, atheist, woke, and it's all boils down to money. A lot of these churches and things that have been leftified, if that's a word, have been funded and given this. But anyway, that hit me while you were while you were saying that, is there was division then, because you still had a lot of people that were loyal to King George, loyal to the crown, but you still had this revolution starting to surge. So in the 1770s, most colonists still considered themselves aligned with England, just kind of like what I was mentioning. Many parishioners, can't say that quite right, but questioned the fundamental legitimacy of revolution and of separating from Britain and consequently the Church of England. From their pulpits, these members of the Black Robe Regiment that you mentioned reassured their audiences that their revolution was justified in the eyes of God. Winning and maintaining the support of the population was critical in the American War for Independence. You had to have enough people to support the cause, which relied heavily on the support of volunteers and the general population. So I'm going to mention one of these Black Robe Regiment figures. His name was Peter, I would say, Muhlenberg, and he's probably the most iconic, most famous figure from the Black Robe Regiment. He was a Virginia minister. He accepted, check this out, it's pretty cool. He accepted a commission to lead a regiment in the Continental Army, but yet he was still a pastor. Muhlenberg preaching to his congregation in his clerical robes, only to strip them off and reveal his military uniform underneath. A dramatic appeal for men to join the patriot struggle. Muhlenberg served as an officer in the Continental Army throughout the war and commanded a brigade at the Battle of Yorktown. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie The Patriot, but The Patriot has a figure kind of like Muhlenberg, who is a pastor of a church, and then the pastor, they're going around looking for volunteers to join the army, and the pastor basically says, all right, it's time for me to go to fight and lead my flock. Who's going to come with me? Right. Because of the American independence cause. So, that was a real thing. Question is, in 2024, would we be willing to do that, and how many would we have?
Right. Yeah, and so the courage and the conviction to stand on certain principles is the key part that I want you to see here. Pastors today, we're not necessarily having to go sign up and fight a battle or fight a war, but we do need to speak the truth.
It's a different kind of fight.
It's a different kind of fight. And we cannot be afraid and scared of the consequences of speaking the truth and what that may do to us. Just like these ministers knew that by joining up in the Continental Army, they could be killed with a bullet or with a cannon or with a sword. They could lose their life, but yet because of their convictions, they did it anyways. And the same for us today. Even though it may cost us members, it may cost us likes on YouTube, it may cost us things, friends and families may not understand us per se. Do we have the moral conviction to know what's right and wrong about the issues of today and put a voice to it? We need a new Black Robe Regiment to arise in this country in a different sense, but still arise and not be afraid of the consequences to speak the truth in love. Another example is when the British Parliament imposed the Stamp Act, his first direct tax on the colonists, an attempt to pay for their 7-year war. So this was in 1756 to 1763 that this war took place, and so this Stamp Act was to help pay for it. Well, in 1766, Congregationalist minister Jonathan Mayhew preached a sermon in Boston that would shape the colonists' reaction not only to the Stamp Act, but to relations with England. So watch. Taxes. Britain taxed the colonists, and then a preacher preached against the taxes.
For a war that happened in France, and between England and France. Probably had not anything to do with the colonists because most of them were in the colonies.
Right.
But let's tax you. Boy, don't we love taxes.
And I was about to say, so today, we are in like $42 trillion in debt. We'll never pay that back. We'll never pay that back. But how many sermons do you hear, how many preachers do you hear talk openly about about the taxation and about the debt and about the things that are killing this country right now. I have certainly preached sermons. I don't preach it all the time, but I have preached sermons about those specific issues and how it's going to negatively affect us. But these were sermons that people used to preach and talk about in terms of preachers because of how irresponsible it was for leaders to do this to a country.
It was just wrong.
It's wrong to just rape and pillage your populace because you don't know how to lead correctly, which is where we are today. Again, why that book, Shepherds for Sale, is so valuable, good information, is because that agenda needs the preacher to sit down, shut up, be quiet, and follow the rules. Yep. And we must speak the truth. But this Pastor Jonathan here, began to preach, and he began to talk about civil liberty. Again, this is before the American Revolutionary War. He explained that laws that are made by common consent and choice, that all have some hand in framing them what they should be, at least by their representatives chosen to act for them, if not for their own persons. When government ignores this principle, he said, the subjects are in a state of slavery. Mm-hmm. This would be the state of the American colonists, he would preach and teach, that if they are to possess no property, nor to enjoy the fruits of their own labor because of the taxation that is taking place, but by mere precarious pleasure of the mother country, talking about England, or of a distant legislator in which they neither are nor can be represented. He was talking about how evil that is, that you have no voice in your leadership, but yet your leadership is going to confiscate your wealth to do as they please with it, and you cannot even say anything about it, which again, we're in 2024 with an election coming up.
Yeah. So this sermon that he preached extended the argument that he had developed in the 1750 pamphlet called A Discourse Concerning Unlimited Submission to the Higher Powers. You don't hear that kind of talk much, do you? Which made the case that it could be appropriate to resist unjust authority. 14-year-old John Adams read and reread it until the substance of it was incorporated into my nature and indelibly engraved on my memory. That was a quote that John Adams said. This sermon, Adams later said, would help anyone understand the principles and the feelings which produced the revolution. I'm going to say that again, that it would help anyone understand the principles and the feelings which produced the revolution. You had other documents like Common Sense by Thomas Paine, I believe, and things like that started talking about how the government is doing things that are unjust. Are we just going to sit back and just let them? Or are we going to stand up? So a Library of Congress exhibit explains religion, listen to this, religion played a major role in the American Revolution by offering a moral sanction for opposition to the British and assurance to the average American that revolution was justified in the sight of God. As a recent scholar has observed, by turning colonial resistance into a righteous cause and by crying the message to all ranks and all parts of the colonies, ministers did the work of secular radicalism and did it better.
Yeah, so do you think the preachers in 1770 would lose their IRS tax exemption status for endorsing political candidates? Yes, they would.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And that's a tool that the government has placed upon churches, is with the IRS, that you're going to lose your tax exemption if you get too political. And that political correctness is one of the tools that the liberal left has used to silence preachers and make them scared to death, man. But if you're on the other side, then you can endorse every left-wing agenda item that you want, and nobody's ever going to touch you or anything else in terms of the IRS. Again, showing you the tactics that has been the tactics that have been used to shut down the preachers in America. So let's finish it up right here. About to close it down. So ministers served the American cause in many capacities during the Revolution. That has been well established, as military chaplains, as penmen for committees of correspondences, and as members of state legislators, constitutional conventions, and the National Congress. They took up arms, leading continental troops to battle. All throughout the American Revolution, churches and pastors played a major, major role in it. And so you begin to think about sermons now from a biblical worldview perspective of why that is so vitally important for a society and for a culture and for a nation, that God is the creator, the idea of the nature of God, the divine providence, and the supreme judge of the world. These kinds of sermons during the Great Awakening helped create the Declaration of Independence. These Christian teachings had significant influence on the founding fathers and how they constructed the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. That was not from a Marxist point of view. It was not from a communist point of view or a socialist point of view. It was from a biblical point of view. The belief that humans were sinful contributed to the adoption of the constitutional system characterized by the separation of powers, checks and balances, and federalism, rather than a strong centralized government run by experts. Even today, in this political season that we're in, with the two political candidates, the Republicans and the Democrats, you had the vice president on the Democratic ticket that was at a fundraiser who was advocating for the destruction of the electoral college system. And he was advocating for just majority rule, majority vote. Why does the liberal left want to deconstruct the electoral college that was put in place by the founders of the country? Is so that they can have total control. Because then you would have no voice unless you are in the big cities, in the big states.
Places like Alabama would be completely ignored.
Our values and the way we think would not matter anymore. It would only be California. It would be San Francisco,
New York,
for everybody. That's right. And so the founders understood that. That's the reason they put those checks and balances in there, because they had a biblical worldview and they recognized that there will be evil people who arise in this country one day who want to be the king again, who want to be the emperor, who wants to be the all ruler, because they had seen that in King George and throughout history with the emperors of Rome. It is innate in people to go down that path whenever you remove God from anybody. An understanding of liberty as the freedom to do what is morally correct. The belief that humans are created in the image of God. These are biblical worldviews, which led them to conclude that we, the people, as opposed to the elite, can order our public lives better through politics rather than by force. In other words, talking it out and voting, having representatives. It also helped inform early and later American opposition to slavery, which is going to be part 4 of this teaching. We're going to look at the role that the preachers had in the North and the role that the preachers had in the South, and we'll take some accountability to those roles. But the need to protect religious freedom, the founders understood that, and eventually to drop support for established religions, primarily because they thought that such establishments hurt true religion. So the separation of church and state was not for the destruction of the church.
That's right.
It was to make sure that it was to protect the church from the state.
So the church could function as high as it wanted to.
That's right.
And then keep the government separate.
Yes. It wasn't to protect the state from the church. It was to protect the church from the state.
Yeah.
Because again, they had seen what King George had done to the Church of England. If he wanted to change something, he just changed it, and the church had to go along with it. And so it was to keep that separate. So by design, the new U.S. government was not religious in the sense of requiring allegiance to any particular faith. It was rather dedicated to a comprehensive protection of the religious exercises of all of its citizens. The framers knew by experience that this protection would allow people of faith to continue to exercise the powerful influence that had created the free nation that they now understood as America.
Why do you think they made it the First Amendment?
Freedom of speech.
And freedom of religion.
Religion, that's right. And so these things were critical to the founding of our country. And in 2024, that is not what you see. It is a vastly different landscape of churches, of preachers, and in the role that those churches play. Again, I keep bringing that book up, The Shepherds for Sale, because I think it really gives a great insight of what has happened and why controversies has arisen in the church where there shouldn't be any controversy in some of these areas. Ultimately, we need to repent. Ultimately, we need to get on our face before God. We need to bow humbly before the Lord and say we have blown it in areas as a nation, as a church, as religious leaders, and accept our responsibility in what has been created, and then ask for forgiveness, and then pick up the pieces and move it forward.
Yeah.
So I hope that you're praying about the election. I hope you're praying about our country. I hope you are planning on to vote. I hope the people that are watching this and listening to this are not part of that 40 to 100 million people that may not be voting. I hope that you do go and let your voice be heard. Let's just pray, believe God. We know that the heart of the king is in the hand of God, so ultimately it's God's will. We're living in the end times. We understand that, but we're going to work until Jesus comes back.
Yeah.
So thank you guys so much for joining us. Make sure you like this, subscribe to it, and come back next Tuesday as we continue this conversation, as we look at the role of the preachers in the Civil War time period of America. So God bless. We see you then.